Okay, so over to you.
Right, thank you. Okay, so yes, as Nick's saying, I'm background in community development work and community project development, and the key concern in my professional life has been how, as groups of people, do we develop effective projects that are going to really make a difference. So what I'm intending to look at here is this question of how can we work together to build effective initiatives that can actually make a difference to systems. So we've heard from the wider picture this morning, and then from a very specific example with David at the University of Edinburgh about some really significant change. I want to look a bit underneath that at actual processes of systemic change. And so this particular theory is a very quite recently developed theory over the last 15 years or so. And what I'm going to explore in this journey then is what do I mean by systemic change to start with, putting theory U in that context. Have a look at learning, have a look at leadership in change, and then innovation. How can we look at initiatives that we might take, and how do we design those in the most promising way to make them effective? And we'll have a look at examples as we go through this journey. So, systems change is a field of work that's been developing over more than 100 years, and here are a couple of the people who've done some of the early work in systems change. Julia Prigogine has with a background in chemistry and thermodynamics, to this concept of self-organising systems. Umberto Maturana, who is still around in his 80s, and he introduced this concept of autopoiesis, how living systems maintain themselves. Coming into more recent times, we've got a couple of quite well-known names. Margaret Wheatley has done a lot of work around how the new science, such as quantum physics, may be valuable in organisational leadership. And Peter Senge has done a great deal of work in how learning takes place in organisations and complex systems. And then there's a lot of practical applications. So again, here are people who've done some quite pioneering work in how we can apply these methods. Harrison Owens with his open space approach, Juanita Brown with the World Cafe, and we'll be using some of that tomorrow for those of you staying for tomorrow's session. David Cooper, IDA and Appreciative Inquiry. The Change Handbook is a great manual of different methods, over 60 methods for systemic change, working with organisations. However, the version of that I've got, 2007, doesn't include Theory U because it was still in development at that time. So, Theory U then, what's it all about? Well, Otto Scharmer is the guy who's done the fundamental development work on this, and his colleagues at Massachusetts Institute of Technology. In 2 bullet points, I'm trying to summarise the fundamentals of Theory U, which is not easy, but it talks about a journey where you go down the U to begin with, to see the system from perspective of the whole picture and become aware of your own role and your own prejudices and assumptions in that picture. And something happens at the bottom of the U here, which we'll explore in more detail as we go along. And then you start to come up the other side, where you begin to sense what's being called for and begin to develop prototypes to experiment. Theory U has been described as leading from the future as it emerges. Well, how can you possibly lead from the future? Is that a bit of science fiction? Surely all we know about is the past, all we can learn from is the past. So that's what I'm going to try and tease out a bit here. What does that mean? So a key part of Theory U, and what perhaps is one of the things that distinguishes it from many other approaches, is that it takes a careful look at who we are in change initiatives. How aware are we of ourselves and our perspectives? Perhaps are we playing some role in how the system is stuck, and beneath that, how can we release that stuckness? A brief story about Otto Scharmer, just to put it in context. He describes at the age of 16 getting a phone call when he was at school in Germany, say you better come home quickly, and home was an hour's journey away, an old farmhouse, 200-year-old farmhouse where his family had lived for all his life. And as he approached the house, there were vast plumes of smoke in the air, and when he got there, the place had been completely razed to the ground by a fire. And he says that as he stared into the smoking embers, recognising that his entire kind of reference point for his whole life had disappeared in the smoke, he felt some sort of change taking place and felt something calling him forward. It was not about his past and all that he thought he was, but something about what his life was meant to be about. And shortly afterwards, his grandfather, who was in hospital and ill, arrived in a taxi. And he says that his grandfather, without even looking at the smoking embers, strode up to where his father was working on a clear-up operation. And this is all he said to him, in German, of course: "Keep your head up, my boy. Look forward." And he then went back to the taxi, returned to the hospital, and he never returned to the farmhouse after that. But so, can we do this? Our challenge is to make changes, perhaps without burning starting any fires that burn the house down, and hopefully without starting fires that heat the planet up to 4 degrees as well. Yes, just a word about systemic change then, as a historical example, taking colonialism as something that, you know, if we go back 100 years, many Western European countries would have accepted colonial rule as quite the norm and the done thing, with these sort of ideas around the right to rule, and that we've got the right civilization, and of course we've got the Bible, and this gives us all sorts of rights. Well, whilst those ideas might now persist in some quarters, fundamentally the norms have shifted, haven't they? We don't accept that these sort of things are the right thing to do anymore. Now, you could argue that a different system is now in place which still ensures that the flow of wealth is from the poor countries to the rich. I wouldn't dispute that, really, and so the need for change is perhaps as great as it ever is. But there has been a significant shift there. Okay, so theory U suggests that there are two fundamentally different kinds of learning that take place. The first being the way of learning that we... this line doesn't make any difference, does it? The first being the way of learning that we use most of the time, and is fine for many situations, where we do something, we look at what happens, learn from the response, plan the next action and act again. So we're essentially learning from the past, from the models that we've already established. However, there is another option, which is to do with exploring what the future is calling for. So let's look a little bit more. What Otto Scharmer and his colleagues did was interview about 150 leading scientists, business leaders, civic leaders, other people who'd done some sort of innovative work, had made a real difference in their organisations, and tried to find out whereabouts did that innovation come from, what was the source of their inspiration. And they began to develop this model of 4 different levels of responses to a stimulus, to change. We can all rush around doing some, applying some sticking plaster fixes, and all we do is essentially change the light bulbs. We can go a bit further down. We can look at policies. We can even look at our own values and beliefs. And at its deepest level, what theory U proposes is that we can get to a point where we are in touch with a deeper source of what's being called for. And by the way, I'm going to be scribbling notes down. There are some handouts which I'll pass out at the end of the presentation, which have the key slides, not all of the slides, but the key slides, which help make sense of this. And if we can get here, then we can potentially generate tremendous commitment and will. So, taking a look at leadership then, how do we get to that point? Well, most courses, and if you go on a business school course or pick up a textbook about leadership, there's plenty of information about how do you get the kind of results that you want, and how do you go about that. So what are you doing and how are you going to do it? What's perhaps not covered so often is who you are in the process of leadership. And this doesn't necessarily mean you're the Prime Minister. There can be leadership, as we know, at every level. What's the inner point from which we are making a change, taking an initiative? Here's a proposition, which you may or may not agree with, that the success of an intervention depends on what's happening inside the person taking the initiative, making the change. I just want to introduce a couple of examples. So Nelson Mandela, if you read Long Walk to Freedom, you get the sense of a man who knew very well that major change was coming in South Africa, and that he'd been locked up for 27 years. You could imagine that he might be a bit resentful of the way he'd been treated. But he seemed to recognise that the situation called for something beyond reacting to that sort of degrading treatment which the majority of people experience. And there could have been a bloodbath, clearly, at the end of apartheid, and there wasn't. So Gandhi dedicated much of his life to freeing India from British colonial rule, and yet he never struck a blow. Just a man committed again to something beyond just getting his own back and reacting to that oppression. He was calling for a contact with higher values. However, he was of course involved with a team of people working for the independence of India, not all of whom shared those values. Perhaps if you look at Freedom at Midnight, is a book which describes that journey of India's release from colonialism, and the chap Jinnah, the leader of the Muslim community, was very determined that a separate state should be formed, and what eventually resulted was a bloodbath, essentially, enormous suffering. So the team has to be committed to the goal, not just one person. And I'm sure we can all think of local examples of projects that we've been involved with, some of which have been really successful and others less so. Recently I've been involved in a community initiative, transition town-based idea really, in Doncaster, in North Doncaster, which I felt had huge potential to make a difference to the area. However, we didn't reach those deeper points of the U in the leadership team, and what eventually emerged was a great deal of conflict amongst the directors and with the staff as well, and in the end the project had to be closed down. So there's a danger if you don't get there of what can happen. Contrasted to that, is the experience of developing this event, actually, which has been a really positive one. I think all of us involved in this have worked really well together. Nobody's stormed out the room, and it's actually been a really enjoyable experience. Okay, so let's have a look at what Theory U talks about in terms of the journey to innovation that's effective. Fundamentally, what it suggests is that the journey begins with really looking at what's going on and spending some time doing that, finding out about the situation, finding out about each other, sharing perspectives, perhaps suspending our own ideas and judgments and snap solutions, because it may take a bit more than that. And then coming to a point where we're not in a rush, we allow time to reflect on the whole situation and allow something to emerge. So we're no longer quite pushing in the same way here. It's more an opening that takes place. But coming out of this, the other side of the U, things start to happen quite quickly, and we start experimenting and prototyping. So here's a bit more detail of the journey. And again, this is on the handout, so I won't go through everything in it. But what it's talking about is, in the blue, what are the processes that are happening for us on this journey. Um, and also, what can get in the way of these processes on the far side there. Judgment, cynicism and fear that come into play as we get further down here and begin to release some of our assumptions and perhaps dearly held values and perspectives, because we need to listen to people with different values to ourselves. So these are the sort of conditions that may allow this to happen, and this really is a key challenge for leaders, and it calls for facilitation skills. Not that you have to be a professional facilitator, many people can have a go at this, but it's a skill set, I think, which needs to be developed far more if we are going to lead successful change initiatives. So here's 5 stages then of the journey through Theory U. And what you may notice on here is the word co keeps coming up and connecting. It is very much about how we work together, listening to one another, sharing the journey, finding effective ways of working together. And I want to take a brief look at an example of where Theory U has been applied in the area of Bavaria in Germany to the healthcare system. So here's an example of the journey that was taken with this model in mind, that because the healthcare system was essentially not working very well and it was stressing everybody out, nobody was very satisfied with it, neither the doctors nor the patients, nor the emergency care staff nor the administrators. They said, well, maybe we can do it differently. And they brought together a group of people who were willing to spend some time, take some time out, talk together, listen together. And they created a kind of huge wall map of how the healthcare system was operating. And above all, what emerged from that was that everybody, especially the patients and the doctors, wanted to be working at the level of kind of causal issues. What was making people's lives not work so well, they were getting ill. What was actually happening is they were working at symptom level, and they were applying sticky plaster solutions. And when a lot of people started to see that, then something started to happen down this bottom part of the U. There was a recognition that these are common concerns and also common aspirations to work at a deeper level. So they began from this to think, well, how could we do it differently? How could we experiment with different systems? And above all, how can we build different patient-doctor relationships, which are right at the centre of any decent healthcare system? And some of the initiatives that they came out with, not all of them, but some of them that seem to be working, have been scaled up and are now operating through the region. So it has made a significant difference to how healthcare is delivered. So if we want to develop experiments then at this sort of the right-hand side of the U, what can we do? Well, here's a guideline to some tests for prototypes. Again, this is on the handout, so I'll not go through all of them, but perhaps I'll just draw your attention particularly to number 3 as a really intriguing question to ask. If we're considering an initiative, is it revolutionary? Can it actually change the system, even on a small scale? Does it somehow tap into the systemic root issues? Okay, so we've looked at the question of who we are as the central issue for systems change. We've looked at learning and at leadership. At this U journey, as I said, there's maps in the handouts as to how that works. So the thing is that I want to point out here really especially is that how action, if you follow this kind of journey, the action that results from it can be quite different to what you might do without following a journey of that sort. So to take the example of the healthcare system, it would have been easy to apply a range of quick-fire initiatives to try and G things up. What they didn't do that. They took some time out to try and map the whole situation and really consider, well, what is actually going to make a more fundamental difference here. So here's a couple of key references to find out more about theory U, including Otto Scharmer's book itself. And on the website there's all sorts of resources, including a much more detailed version of the presentation that I've just done there. I mean, I've adapted that and added some other stuff in, but the original version that Otto Scharmer did was it's very comprehensive, and it also shows you a kind of opposite U, which goes upwards, as to how things can go pear-shaped in change initiatives, because you're following a different sort of journey, which is very interesting to look at. And the Presenting Institute generously offers these resources on a sort of commons license, so you're free to adapt them, which is what I've done here. I'm grateful for that. So I think that's it for now. It's over to all of us.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I think that's a great